Chapter 14. Alex thought she'd been dreaming when she heard a buzzer, as if it was stuck. Then a loud ring, then a pause, and the ringing started again over and over, and she wondered why someone didn't get the door. Finally she sat up, glanced around, looked out at the buildings and realized where she was, and it wasn't a dream, but a nightmare that she was still in a hotel and not in her bed at her home. She'd fallen asleep after a shower, and crawled under the covers naked, the way she used to do when Max was due to come home from one of his overseas trips. Stepping to the floor, rushing to see who was constantly ringing the bell, and why Jonas hadn't answered by now because he was a light sleeper, she panicked, questioning if something had happened to Jonas. Alex searched around for her robe. She found the nearest one, shrugged her arms through a robe that the hotel had provided, and hurried to Jonas's room. He wasn't there. Perhaps he'd forgotten his key. No, that wasn't it. He could have gotten one at the desk. Then who the fuck is it? She wondered when she opened the door without looking through the peephole. When she pulled the door open, standing in front of her was Max. Her heart hammered in her chest, her eyes brightened, and she almost smiled with relief, but she didn't want to show any emotion, so she schooled them back, furrowed her brow and said, "What do you want?" "I want to come in." Max's voice deep and sexy. His eyes roving over her from her hair to her breasts. Her breathing accelerated, and her mind begged her not to let him in, but her heart weakened and said differently, and she stood back with Max locking eyes with hers, and he sauntered inside as if he had her under a spell like a cat would do with a mouse. She was his now, but the spell was quickly broken when the oxygen returned to her brain. "Do you know what time it is?" Alex barked, after crossing her arms over her breast. "Yes. But I couldn't sleep," Max admitted. "And how is that my problem now?" Alex questioned. "I am your problem. We have children together and," Alex stopped Max in mid-conversation. "You've taken my children. I'll let you see them if you come back to me." What the fuck? Alex thought. Did I miss something? Am I in a parallel universe where there are two Maximilians? You divorced me without me having anything to say about that, and then I see you sitting and enjoying a conversation with a woman, your secretary who you called Jack, leading me to believe that she was a man. What do you say about that? I didn't think you knowing that my secretary was a woman would affect you. It was just business, Alex. Like you and me. Nothing is like you and me, Alex said, and when she watched Max look down and pass his tongue over his lips, his eyes half-lidded, she realized that her robe had fallen open, and when she reached to tie the belt, he caught her hand. His head lowered, and before she could resist or say no, he had his warm mouth suckling her breasts, her nipples exploding in his mouth, and his hand between her legs as his finger brushed over her clit. The heat of his body close to hers, his large hands palming her mound, as her hips shot forward, and her juice dripping down on Max's finger as he pushed it in and pulled it out of her opening. When Max pulled his mouth from her breasts, and his finger from her pussy, a gasp fell from her mouth and her legs weakened and she fell into his arms. All she remembered was that he was carrying her somewhere, and when he kicked open her bedroom door and entered it, he laid her on the bed ever so gently. She heard him toe off his shoes, open the belt to his pants, move his zipper downward, and the thump of his pants being thrown across the bench. She saw him lean over her naked, and he laid his powerful chest over her. She felt him help her take off her robe and say, "Magnificent. I will never let anyone have you." Alex should have known something then, but she was too much in love with Max to care what he'd said. She just wanted to feel him near her. She'd missed looking into his stunning face as she passed her hands over his stubble jaw. Now, at this time, she didn't care how or why he was there because she wanted and needed him. Therefore, when he eased down her body after sucking her breasts hard, his tongue licking down her body, his large hands opening her legs as his tongue licked along her folds, and then her clit, and her wet opening, Alex let out a moan of pleasure and screamed Max's name as she reached and took a handful of his silky dark hair. Alex opened her legs wide as Max's tongue massaged her clit until she was ready. "Max, fuck me," Alex screamed once again. He acted as if he didn't hear her, and continued licking, sucking, and kissing her tender clit, torturing her as she squirmed and twisted with her legs wrapped firmly around his slim waist. Alex was ready and heated beyond her imagination. She dug her fingers into Max's shoulders, breaking his skin. He leaned up and gazed at her. She was indeed vulnerable again. Not that woman in the restaurant who'd threatened him and walked away, but so was Max. Alex could feel Max's pre-cum cock rub against her leg as he placed his muscular arms on both sides of her, where she could look into his eyes. She saw lust, desire, love, but she couldn't figure out the smirk on his face as he reached for his full heavy cock and stroked it, lined it up with her quivering opening, and said, "Baby, feel me and don't ever forget what I feel like." And when he shoved his length into her body, she knew that she would never forget this night. The moment Max entered her tight opening, her orgasm couldn't be contained, and it covered his hard shaft, and he said, "I feel you, Alex. Your tight pussy squeezing my cock. That's what I've always known about you. You were the only woman who could make me feel something. I need you. I need you to make me feel again. I thought I could do without you, but now I know that I can't." Alex wanted Max, but she didn't hear what she wanted. She wanted an apology for making her feel alone and thrown away by him. She wanted an apology for taking her children, and she wanted most of all to hear that he loved her the way she loved him. Predictably, she didn't get it, but she knew one thing for sure, that before she'd go back to him if he asked her, it would be on her terms. Another thing that was inescapable was that Max couldn't live without her, and she had to make him see that. Was he that arrogant and narcissistic to believe that it was all about him, and all he had to do was make love to her, and all would be forgotten? She knew that if she gave him what he needed this night, she was on her way to bringing Maximilian to his knees in more ways than he'd anticipated. "Turn on your stomach," he demanded. Still playing the game of dominant, she thought. She would play his games, but she had a few of her own. Alex rolled over as he sat on his haunches. Then he reached and placed his finger inside her wet, soggy opening filled with his cum, and without the tightness of before, Max leaned up and filled her once more with his thick, magnificent cock. Holding Alex with his hand underneath her stomach, pounding into her opening, she thought it unusual that he wanted only her pussy when he'd been a man who wanted everything from her. His desires were insatiable. His sexual needs bordered on the extreme, and she had been up to the task since she'd married Maximilian Blackstone. He'd spanked her with his strong palm until her ass was red, and he'd come all over her ass from seeing his handiwork. She'd tied him up, teased his cock, sucked him off until she thought he couldn't come anymore, but he'd look up at her with half-lidded eyes, his legs and arms held by restraints, and said, "More. Give me more of the same, and this time whip me harder." To Alex's surprise this time, he insisted that he'd fuck her first, and he did. The night had gone, and he was still inside her opening, and Alex had lost count of how many times they'd both come. Then Max raised from his sleep, Alex's head on his chest, and he asked, "Do you have any restraints or a belt? I need something now. I need you to punish me the way you used to as my dominant. I'm out of control. Don't you know how much I've wanted you?" No, Alex didn't know. He hadn't made that known lately. All she felt from him was anger and resentment for her trying to help out Jonas. She wanted to have a discussion with Max. Maybe they could see a family therapist to iron out their disagreements. It had worked before, why not now, she thought. Alex wanted this badly so she could get home to her children and salvage their marriage. The way Max had taught her to make love to him, and he to her, who else could compete with what Max had taught her sexually to enjoy? How could she even get used to another man, the way she'd become? Alex wasn't used to a normal sexual relationship with a man. Max had been her first love, her first man, and she thought he would be her last. How could she adjust to a normal life if there was none with Maximilian? She'd wondered. Chapter 15. The sex had been wonderful, but there was something missing, and Alex knew it. Maybe she would find it now that Max had asked her to be his dominant once more, if only for tonight. Maybe he'd realized that she is the only woman who could satisfy him. It had been fortuitous that she found a shop that sold her what she needed. Alex didn't know that she would need these things this soon, but she believed that one day Max would come to her because, after all, try as he may, he never found another woman who could give him what he needed in so many ways. When Max had laid on his stomach and she'd reached for the package in the drawer, she pulled out of the bag a crop, handcuffs, and leather restraints. She wished she had her whip and a cane, because she wanted to give him a few lashes on his hard, firm ass, and maybe the tip of his penis or his balls. The sting from her whip always brought his cock to life after a long session or after he'd returned home spent from traveling and too many meetings. Crawling across Max's superb muscular body, she tied his wrists first and then his ankles. She wouldn't use the handcuffs unless she had to. I want you to lie there and don't say a word. If I hear you protest or cry out, I'm going to abuse you more in ways you've never experienced, Alex whispered into his ear, as she leaned over his back, brushing her nipples over his skin, watching goosebumps rise as she moved down between his legs. Alex. Quiet, she barked. If you speak and call my name again, I will take the restraints off and you can leave and go to whoever you want. I don't care anymore. But in reality, Alex did care. She cared too much for Maximilian, and she'd hoped for this day when he'd come to her, instead of seeking out someone else to relieve his sexual desires. Looking at Max's body, strong and lean, what a magnificent man, she thought. And he's no longer her husband. In dismay and resentment, Alex aimed the crop, started at his waist, and trailed it slowly down to his buttocks, raised it, and with the flick of her wrist she brought the crop down on his ass brutally over and over. Max tried to reach for his cock, but he'd been restrained from doing so. Those were his wishes, because he didn't want any artificial stimulation. He wanted and needed Alex to bring him to orgasm with what she'd been capable of doing before. After dotting Max's ass with lashes of her crop, and when it turned red, she knew he'd had enough and was ready for her to suck him off. She untied his wrist and ankles, and when he once more laid on his back and looked down on her, she barked, "Don't look at me. Or I'll blindfold you. And don't touch me." Max averted his eyes upward as Alex leaned over him, with her full breasts dragging along his body. Her taut nipples trailed over his lips where he opened his mouth. She quickly pulled them away and continued down his body as she reached for his cock and stroked it from the base to the tip, and then she opened her mouth and took his thick, full, erect cock into her warm mouth. Alex heard a sigh of relief, a moan of pleasure. A taste of pre-cum fell on her tongue. It tasted familiar. It tasted like Max. Alex sucked his cock hard and took it down her throat without gagging, and Max remembered to stay still and not move because the feeling had been wonderful. Max had an inclination to grab his length and help place it in Alex's mouth when she pulled her face away, But he knew if he did that she would stop at that moment, and he would be left frustrated, and he didn't want to enrage Alex because he didn't want to go to anyone but her. How could he have been so short-sighted as to pull a stunt the way he did? Get a divorce when he knew deep down he'd needed Alex just to breathe, just to carry on with his life, and not to mention his sexual desires, which were a great part of living in this chaotic world of being a Blackstone. He had to tell her that he was wrong, but he couldn't talk. She'd forbade him to say a word, otherwise she'd put him out, and all that would have been his fault. Now he had to lie still and let Alex work her magic on his body, where he'd be able to rest and sleep to carry on what he had to do the next day. And rest he did with her lying on his chest and his comb all over her. When his phone rang, he was stepping out of the shower, and Alex was still asleep. He moved to the next room to answer it and not disturb her. He had meetings today, and he was ready after what had happened last night. Max knew now what had to be done. "There's a problem at one of your plants in Hong Kong, and you have to fly over there today," his secretary insisted. "Can't the plant manager handle it, Jack?" "No. Only you can clear up the problem with the personnel. They want to see your face and talk to you." Max knew he should have closed that plant or sold it years ago. Alex had been right. There was no way he could sustain a marriage and be there for his children with the kind of schedule he'd had, and with all these properties and businesses, and everything had become far worse now that he'd sent Jonas away. Jonas had been a stand-in, and since they looked undistinguishable from each other, he'd sent Jonas to his overseas plants, but he didn't have that cover anymore, and that was another thing he had regretted, sending his brother away. "I'll be at the airfield in 20 minutes. Max looked at Alex lying naked, and he moaned. He had to leave her once more when he had so much to confess, tell her, beg her to forgive him, but like always he didn't have the time. He didn't even have time to leave her one of his infamous notes. Max rushed out of the hotel, climbed into his limo waiting, and parked on the ramp in front of the hotel door. When Max was boarding his private jet headed to Hong Kong, Jonas was entering a cab with two girls from a club. For once he took Alex's advice, and not gone to a BDSM club. He felt that this would be safer than being tied up and maybe left in some hotel room all night, and have the maid find them, and it would end up in the papers the next day. He could see the headlines: Maximilian's bad boy twin handcuffed to a bed in one of his Millennium hotels. TMS would have a field day with those pictures and video, he thought, so he sauntered into a club nearby, one of his favorite BDSM spots. And now Jonas was headed to a party at one of the girls' boyfriend's apartment. Jonas met the girls on the dim-lit dance floor, where he inserted himself in the middle of their gyration, their bumping and grinding on each other. He didn't know their names, and he wasn't interested in finding out who they were because he was looking for one thing, and that was when the fuck was he going to get laid. On entering the apartment, one girl introduced Jonas to the crowd of drunken young men and women in their early 20s. The men remarked in a joke that Jonas may have been past his bedtime. But the girls said they wanted him there because he was handsome, and they liked men in their 30s because they were more matured. Jonas probably should have known better than to party with a bunch of entitled, out-of-controlled 20-something girls and guys. After all, he'd been one himself, and it got him into all kinds of trouble. Nevertheless, he decided to stay at least until he could get one or two of the girls to give him a blowjob, and another later for him to fuck. As Jonas sauntered through the crowd, he watched some of them smoking and drinking, and he thought some were using drugs. He'd been drunk most of the day, even after declaring that he was off the stuff, but with all the shit that had gone on in his life, with his wife being dead, Alex appearing to not want him around, and his brother Max thinking that he was useless, He needed something to ease his pain, and so he drank hard liquor for the first time in months. With his hands over the girl's shoulder, Jonas whispered in her ear, "Can we go someplace where we can be alone?" "Sure." And she led him into a room at the far end of the hall. They closed the door and didn't lock it. Jonas, in his inebriated state, fell across the bed, and all he felt and heard was his zipper easing down and his pants being pulled past his ass. Jonas did remember the girl saying, "Nice cock and a thick long one. I can't wait to get that inside me." When the girl sat on his cock and pushed it inside her, he felt it come alive, and he reached and placed his hands on her hips. He punched his hips upward, and now with a stiff erection, he let her ride him rough, biting, scratching, and bringing him to orgasm. After a much-needed release, he felt her body leave him, and that's when he fell asleep. When he woke, the police was standing over him. "Wake up. Wake the fuck up. You're being arrested." In his bleary-eyed state and a muddled mind, Jonas asked, "What did I do?" when the police handcuffed him and marched him out half-naked, his zipper undone, in front of a crowd of strangers he'd only met last night. "There's a woman dead in the alley, and you were the last one to see her alive," one police barked. The only thought Jonas had was, this can't be happening.